problems opening up Integrity Recording, you can try a different browser. It's weird. Blackboard, because it's a third-party application or piece of software, runs best on Firefox, whereas Tegrity, which is made and designed by a different third-party developer, works best on Internet Explorer. So go figure. But sometimes when you have toolbars or stuff, they have pop-up blockers built into them that may prevent Integrity Recording from opening. So you might want to check that too. Also, there's an option when you open one, you can ask it to open it in a new window. So there are various things, if you're having any problem opening Integrity Recording, that you can do to try to take care of the issue. Then of course you can always call IT, and they're the people to call. So this, what I followed when I made this a number of years ago is the presentation of it in a text called Philosophical Conversations, which is a very good text which we use for only one semester at CCBC. Like here, I don't choose my text, and so we went to a different text, so that's fine. But one thing that may raise a question is, remember, people like Aristophanes, and remember we saw that video clip of Aristophanes portraying Socrates as somebody who was a nature philosopher, worried about cutting Zeus out of the picture and getting out a naturalistic explanation for why it rains. So Socrates tried to distance himself from the nature philosophers. He was educated in their views. People like, Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes. Some of these people at the very beginning of that History of Philosophy PowerPoint that I'm not going to ask you questions on, because I just wanted to expose you to a little bit of what was going on in philosophy before Socrates. But looking at Plato's theory of forms, you might say, well, wait a second, here's Socrates advancing a pretty elaborate theory of reality. I thought he wasn't as interested in that kind of stuff as in questions of ethics, like what's the good life for a human being? How ought we to live? And most people call this Plato's theory of forms. It's a question of interpretation in ancient philosophy. And it's simply this: how much of what we see related in Plato's dialogues of Socrates actually happened, or is the real Socrates? And might there be parts of Plato's dialogues where Plato is putting his own views into the mouth of Socrates as a character? Well, to not get off on that tangent, but just to get to the bottom line, the view on that seems to me best and most believable is when Plato wrote his early dialogues, like the Apology, the Meno, the Crito that we read some of, the Phaedo, he was trying to set the record straight as to who Socrates really was. And the picture we get there is probably pretty accurate. However, in what are called the middle dialogues and the later dialogues, you get a lot of Plato's own more developed views put in the mouth of Socrates as a character. And this is what we think is happening with this theory of the forms. So we've got an elaborate theory of reality, which was probably more Plato than Socrates, but a lot of what he did was think in a more organized and technically precise way along the lines that Socrates had already been teaching. In other words, a lot of the stuff that Plato was advancing is probably not stuff that Socrates would have disagreed with. So, this theory of the forms raises a question. Why should we think there are such things? Because we're going to see that Plato argues for a two-tiered version of reality. That there is this world, the world you and I live in, but that there are also, for Plato and Socrates, absolute standards for things that are established forever in another world. Things like what defines a triangle or a circle or the number 5, but also concepts for Plato like moral goodness, justice, also even ordinary things like chairs and desks, and yes, human beings. So this is the theory of the forms, and one thing he's trying to do is counter the views of the sophists and skeptics, and that's one thing he was doing when Socrates shows the boy the problem in geometry. He's trying to counter an objection that said, from one of the sophist philosophers, it said, look, it was called the paradox of inquiry. It says basically inquiry is not something that can be either fruitful or worthwhile. Why? Well, you either know something or you don't. So if you already know something, then you don't need to inquire into things. But if you don't know something, the sophists were very skeptical about our ability to gain knowledge. Because the thought was, if you don't know what you're trying to inquire into, then first of all, how do you even know where to begin? And second, suppose you find what you're looking for, how are you going to recognize it when you find it? So the sophists, a lot of them thought that real knowledge was beyond human abilities. And there's a strain in modern philosophy, in contemporary philosophy, that takes the same tact. The best we can have are opinions and beliefs, but they were very relativistic. One person's opinion is as good as another, and each person is right in what seems true to them. So truth is either relative for the sophists to a society, and they tended to be cultural relativists because they went from society to society and they saw a lot of people in different societies with different views. So Plato and Socrates, and that's an actual bust of Plato's. It's pretty close. Okay, Plato's trying to prove that knowledge, real knowledge, differs from just having opinions about something. And he's going to try to argue that for some things we have real knowledge. and that knowledge is stable. Once I really know something like some of the truths in geometry that we saw Socrates trying to teach this or pull out of the slave boy, I know something that is true for all time. So the stability of knowledge is guaranteed by the objects of knowledge. What is knowledge knowledge of? Now this is important because one of the arguments for the existence of these eternal standards is if knowledge is going to be stable over time, then it has to be knowledge of something that is unchanging and eternal and stable. Mm-hmm.
Is this PowerPoint on record?
Yeah, it's been there for a while. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I just put up one on Aristotle's virtue ethics, where we're going to go soon. So, and this is a short one. It's just a little over 20 slides. Remember, if you print out, this thing in just the outline mode, it'll probably be 2 to 3 pages and give you everything you see here as a study tool. So knowledge has to be, to know something is to have true justified belief of something. That we're not going to go into the details of that view, but I at least cover it quickly in one of these slides. In other words, it doesn't make any sense to say that somebody knows something which is false, right? If we say, well, George knows that Thomas Jefferson was the first president of the United States. Well, he wasn't the first president of the United States. So, if that's false, how can somebody know something that's false? So, if you know something, what you know certainly has to be true. And then again, it's odd to say that you know something or can claim to know something if you don't yourself believe it to be true. So belief is necessary for knowledge, but it's not sufficient. In other words, just because I believe something to be true doesn't mean that it is true. We can sincerely believe what is false, as I say in this slide. But also justified. Here's where we get to Socrates and other philosophers' views that we ought to be able to give good reasons for why we think we know what we do. So for Plato, real knowledge comes about as knowledge of the forms. Now, you'll see page 97. Again, that's from this other text, so that's not what's in your... The pages where this is discussed in your book or in the syllabus. Things in this world for Plato are in a constant state of change, just like the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus said they were. He uses the word becoming. This thing's so big it covers up all the whiteboards. B-E-C-O-M-I-N-G. In other words, nothing is stable in this world. Nothing stays still to be what it is. It's constantly in the state of becoming something else. And Plato says that kind of a constantly moving object can't be the object of stable knowledge. And opinions can be true one day, false the other, right? It's raining. Well, that's false today. Maybe in a couple of days it's true. We meet here on Friday. Sometimes opinion doesn't have good reasons to back it up. might be simply acquired by slick argument or persuasion without good reasons. Whereas knowledge is what is enduring, like, say, the knowledge of geometric truths, the knowledge of what is right and good, what is justice, what is moral virtue. These, Plato thinks, are enduring, always true, grounded in reasons and acquired by instruction. So, in other words, one argument for thinking there are these eternal entities, the forms, the word form came from the Latin formus, which is a translation of the Greek word idea, from which we get our English word idea. But you can't go by that etymology and conclude that for Plato these are just ideas in somebody's mind. Plato is going to argue that they have an existence independent of anybody's mind, which is the hard sell for this, right? So we saw, I believe I played you the part where Socrates discusses things with the slave boy, right? Didn't I? Minos. And in other words, Socrates asks the boy questions, and did I do that? Maybe I didn't. Does somebody remember Socrates drawing in the sand, a geometrical drawing in that first? You know what? Let me go pause this PowerPoint, and I played these before, so I don't know what the deal is, because I had them throw something on to be able to play, because the original Windows stuff wouldn't even play a DVD. So the point is, here is a slave boy, Minos slave boy. Remember, even though slavery is morally repugnant to us today, it was condoned in ancient Greece. But he's portrayed as a slave boy, a Minos slave boy. Minos, one of Socrates' followers, because he has not had a formal education, in geometry. But Socrates draws diagrams and asks the boy questions using what we call the Socratic method. And the thought was that Socrates is not teaching the boy anything, and yet the boy begins to get the answers right. So this raises the question, well, how is it that the boy is getting these answers right if he's never been taught geometry? And what Socrates argues, and it's not the greatest argument in the world, but he argues that, well, if the boy learned geometry, he either learned it in this life, like I did when I went to Polytechnic, but there was no public education in Greece, right? He either learned it in this life or he had to have learned it in a past life. Well, he's a slave boy, so he didn't learn it in this life, so we're supposed to conclude that he must have learned it in a past life, and that his soul pre-existed its present incarnation for the slave boy. And that's why he can get these answers right about geometry. Now, there are other ways to interpret what's going on there. which don't lead to Socrates' conclusion. He gives us what's called a false dilemma, posing only two options for us to choose from. Either the slave boy learned geometry in this life, or his soul must have pre-existed the body and learned it in a previous life, when there are more options going on. But here's the point. Here's the bottom line. Socrates believes these eternal entities are in a realm that our souls go to if we're good and follow philosophy after death. And that's his explanation for what's going on there. So he's saying that knowledge is recollection of something we already knew. His argument is that it's so shocking for a soul to become reincarnated in a body that it forgets a lot of what it knew, or it's knocked in a kind of latent state. But by asking questions, and also in that dialogue, we're supposed to believe that Socrates is only asking the boy questions. He's not teaching him anything. But by asking questions, we can pull this knowledge out of him. So teachers today talk about using the Socratic method, right? But usually what they mean by that is that they're asking the class questions about what they were supposed to have read the previous night, whereas Socrates in the real Socratic method is trying to ask questions that he thinks brings out something that your soul learned before it was incarnated in this body, but is in a latent state. So this is his answer to why it actually makes sense to inquire into the nature of things, that we can bring out this knowledge that we once knew. So when he sees the supporting reasons for the geometric conclusion that Socrates is getting him to see, then he has justification for his belief. So here's the bottom line. If the objects of knowledge have to be stable because knowledge itself, I mean, think of knowledge of geometry. And in Plato's day, Euclid was just solidifying the geometry that you learned in high school, the plane geometry, right? And so it was a big deal in Plato's day. Plato even took some time out to study it. And so geometry is kind of a paradigm of knowledge, and we'll see later on in the course that for later rationalistic philosophers like Descartes, that was also the case. And so the thought is our reason puts us in touch with these entities. So if the slave boy has knowledge, it's not about the imperfect sand drawings of squares and triangles that Socrates is drawing on the sand. But the objects of knowledge are about stable, unchanging entities in another realm. So genuine knowledge is not about such fleeting and changing things as sand drawings. It is not acquired through the senses. Now here, Plato and Socrates raise a point that even pervades philosophy down through the present day, but at least through the rationalists like Descartes. and that is, does human reason, our reasoning abilities, give us an insight into the nature of things that is even better than something we could get with our senses? Well, the claim of rationalists is that this is so, that reason gives us a special ability to find out the deep truths of reality. Now, obviously, not everyone believes this, but this is a central claim of this strain of philosophy. So, genuine knowledge is about what is enduring. It's not about a sand drawing of a triangle or a square, but for Plato, think of it, a good way that philosophers often explain Plato's forms is they're like blueprints. They're like an eternal standard, say, for what a triangle is, for what a square is. And you can have fleeting particular triangles and squares. But for Plato, real knowledge is about these eternal truths. And it's acquired not by our senses. We don't see the forms. They're in another realm. But he argues that our reason can put us in touch with them. So he's, again, in a strain of philosophy called rationalism. He's like Parmenides, who he uses abstract arguments from reason. So he thinks genuine knowledge has to be of what is unchanging, perfect, and eternal. And that doesn't apply to things in this world for Plato. So genuine knowledge for him is of things in this other realm, the realm of the forms. In other words, no matter how perfect the instruments for constructing a triangle or square is, you're still not going to get one that's perfect here. So these exist in a world beyond the senses, known by reason. In other words, the reasoning part of us, he's arguing, can put us in touch with these things that our soul once knew in a much more intimate way. So you can talk about these as the square itself, or the property of squareness. I mean, think about it. Does what it is to be a triangle, did that just come into existence when some human first drew a triangle somewhere? Maybe on the face of a rock? So this is the true object of the slave boy's knowledge. Isn't any particular square or triangle in this world, but it is knowledge of these perfect entities, or of the property of squareness. So Plato talks about there being like an eternal perfect square that represents the property of squareness. And what squareness is hasn't changed, right? It was the same thing for you all if you took geometry just a few years ago as it was for me when I took geometry at Poly a few more years ago. And it's the same as it was in Plato's day. And these are public objects. In other words, we all have the ability to get geometric knowledge. So you can call this the form of a square. He also thinks, and I'm not going to dwell on this, that there are forms for abstract properties like holiness, piety, as I said, justice. Remember, he's discussing that with Thrasymachus. What is justice? But it gets down to our present day. If Martin Luther King was arguing that there are some objective properties that a just law should fulfill, he wasn't arguing that there are properties that we all agree on are just. He's arguing that these are already there. So knowledge then has to be of what's eternal and unchanging. In other words, Plato is not arguing that we had knowledge when we come into this world of particular facts. That in 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? A particular fact like that. He's not arguing, because for him, particular changing facts are just matters of opinion. But knowledge is of things like eternal moral principles, the principles of mathematics that don't change. So they must be unchanging, of objects that are unchanging, not like the fleeting objects in this world. And they would be like the square itself, the equal itself. So we call this the epistemological argument of the forms. Epistemology is a part of philosophy that deals with what we can know. And this says, in order for us to have true, genuine knowledge, it has to be of stable entities like the forms. So the forms must be there. So the previous argument that we considered justifies the existence of the forms by claiming they are needed as the objects of genuine knowledge. They must exist if true knowledge is possible. Now there's another argument that answers the question, well, why should we think these things are there at all? And that's the metaphysical argument. It basically says that if two things share a common property, then there actually exists, then there is something they share in common. In other words, that property exists independently of the particular things that share that property. So one question metaphysics considers is whether anything universal exists, or folks, it's 46 minutes after. We still have 4 minutes. That's why I'm trying to get through this. Everything that exists is only particular, is one version, but the forms say, no, there are also general objects. Shared common characteristics point the way to the existence of the forms as common general objects that are true of more than one thing. In other words, take the general property of squareness. Plato's argument is, if two particular squares, like the ones you see in this diagram, share the common property of squareness, then that property must exist independently of the particular objects. So we're saying that besides particular squares, there is this general form of squareness that's a property they all, Plato uses the word participate in. So that something exists independently of them is then the claim that that something is a form. Like largeness, if two things share largeness, then they share a common form. Okay. Now, the other one is the semantic argument for the forms. Particular things, like when I called the roll, right? I read your proper names, right? I have a proper name, right? It refers and singles me out individually. Well, for Plato, general words like squareness, triangularity, justice, they single out. They're the proper names of the forms of which they're properties. So, in other words, squareness is the proper name of the general property of squareness. Just like Vic Morawski is the proper name of the professor here, right? So, you know, to Plato, general terms are the proper names of forms. Semantics deals with the meaning and reference of words, right? So the idea is that a particular elephant like Gertrude could have that name, but the general name elephant, which is points to a general property all elephants share, and for Plato that general property is a form. So again, for Plato there are actually two worlds, one beyond the realm of the senses where true knowledge is possible and that the soul was acquainted with before birth, and the other is the fleeting material world that you and I live in. Now, obviously, this is not the easiest view to defend, because it's a view that gives us a complicated view of the nature of things, right? That there are not only existing in the universe particular things, but also general properties, you know. So, and the forms are supposedly perfect, right? Whereas no square that we draw here is perfect. No rose is perfectly beautiful, but the form of beauty supposedly is perfectly beautiful. Okay, and I put the contrast, but don't worry about the divided line. We're not going to worry about that. Okay, thank you. I don't want to make you late for your next class.